April 1945. The Third Reich is collapsing, but the fiercest battle of the final weeks isn't against the Germans. It's inside Allied high command. Churchill is desperate to seize Berlin, pressuring Montgomery to push forward. As Stalin's Red Army closes in from the east, one question emerges. Was Berlin a military prize, or the ultimate political bargaining chip for post-war Europe? And if the Western Allies had reached Berlin first, could they have prevented the Iron Curtain? Yet, paradoxically, it was precisely at this moment of impending victory that the Allied coalition experienced its most severe crisis of unity. The question that would define the post-war world order was not whether Germany would be defeated, that was now a foregone conclusion, but rather who would plant their flag first in the smoldering heart of the Nazi capital, and what that symbolic act would mean for the decades to come. This was not merely a military calculation, it was a geopolitical chess match that would determine the fate of Europe for the next half-century. 3 months earlier, in February 1945, the Big Three, Franklin D. Roosevelt, Winston Churchill, and Joseph Stalin, had convened at the Crimean resort town of Yalta to sketch the outlines of the post-war world. The atmosphere was one of uneasy camaraderie, punctuated by moments of genuine tension. Roosevelt, weakened by the illness that would claim his life within weeks, was focused primarily on securing Soviet entry into the war against Japan. Churchill, ever the guardian of the British Empire, was concerned with preserving British influence in the Mediterranean and ensuring that democratic governments would emerge in Eastern Europe. Stalin, however, was playing a longer game. The Soviet dictator had already sacrificed over 20 million of his citizens to defeat the Nazi invader, and he was determined to ensure that the Soviet Union would never again face a threat from the West. His demands were blunt and non-negotiable. The Soviet Union would retain control over Eastern Poland, would dominate the Baltic states, and would occupy a significant portion of Germany itself. The Western leaders, exhausted by years of war and desperate to maintain the fragile alliance, acceded to most of these demands. Most critically for the future of Berlin, the Yalta Protocol established that post-war Germany would be divided into 4 occupation zones, each administered by one of the major Allied powers. The exact boundaries were left somewhat ambiguous, with the understanding that Berlin, located deep within the Soviet zone, would itself be divided into 4 sectors, accessible to the Western Allies via specific corridors. This arrangement, however, was based on a critical assumption that the Western Allies would be the ones to capture the western and southern portions of Germany, while the Soviets would take the east. The precise demarcation lines were to be determined by military operations on the ground. What no one at Yalta could have predicted, least of all Churchill, who expressed private misgivings, was that this framework would become the foundation for a divided Europe. The British Prime Minister had argued strenuously for clearer guarantees of democratic elections in Poland, but Roosevelt, eager to maintain Soviet goodwill for the Pacific War, had chosen to trust Stalin's promises. Churchill would later describe this as the moment when the West sold the soul of Eastern Europe for the prospect of a few months of peace. As March drew to a close, the strategic landscape had shifted dramatically. On the Western Front, Eisenhower's armies, numbering over 4 million men, had achieved a series of spectacular breakthroughs. General Omar Bradley's 12th Army Group was driving toward the Ruhr, Germany's industrial heartland, while General Jacob Dever's 6th Army Group was advancing through southern Germany toward Bavaria. Field Marshal Montgomery's 21st Army Group, positioned in the north, was crossing the Rhine in strength and preparing to thrust into the North German plain. The German forces opposing them, though still formidable on paper, were a shadow of their former selves. The Wehrmacht had lost over 3 million men since D-Day, and the replacements being thrown into the line were often elderly men or teenage boys, equipped with outdated weapons and minimal training. Fuel supplies were critically low, and the Luftwaffe had virtually ceased to exist as an effective fighting force. Despite these weaknesses, German resistance remained fanatical in many sectors, driven by fear of the Soviet advance and the desperate hope that the Western Allies might somehow be persuaded to join them against the Bolsheviks. On the Eastern Front, the situation was even more catastrophic for Germany. The Red Army, now numbering over 6 million men, had overwhelming superiority in every category of military power. Marshal Zhukov, commanding the First Belarusian Front, had assembled an immense force of over 750,000 men, 6,000 tanks, and 9,000 artillery pieces on the Elbe River, directly facing Berlin. To his south, Marshal Ivan Konev's First Ukrainian Front was positioned to drive northward and encircle the city from the flank. Stalin had made it abundantly clear to both commanders that the race to Berlin was a personal competition. Whoever reached the Reichstag first would earn the ultimate prize of Soviet military glory. Eisenhower's intelligence staff, led by Major General Kenneth Strong, was receiving a daily flood of information from a variety of sources: ultra-intercepts of German radio traffic, aerial reconnaissance photographs, prisoner interrogations, and reports from resistance networks. The picture that emerged was one of mounting chaos in the German rear, but also stubborn resistance at key points. One critical intelligence report, dated March 28, 1945, painted a particularly alarming picture of Berlin's defenses. It estimated that the city was defended by over 300,000 men, including elements of the elite SS Panzer divisions that had been withdrawn from the Eastern Front. The report described extensive fortifications, including anti-tank ditches, minefields, and fortified buildings that would make a direct assault a prolonged and bloody affair. What the report failed to mention, because the intelligence analysts could not have known, was that these defenses were largely manned by Volkssturm militia units composed of elderly men and children, with little ammunition and even less training. A more troubling intelligence failure involved the National Redoubt myth. For months, SHAEF intelligence had been receiving reports that the German leadership was preparing to make a last stand in the Alpine mountains of Bavaria and Austria, where they would wage a protracted guerrilla war. Hitler's own statements, broadcast on German radio, had hinted at such a strategy, though it is now clear that these were mostly propaganda designed to maintain civilian morale. Eisenhower, ever cautious, took these reports seriously. He feared that if the German army collapsed in the north but regrouped in the south, the war could drag on into 1946, costing tens of thousands of American lives. The irony of this intelligence picture is that it shaped Eisenhower's strategy in exactly the wrong direction. The fear of the National Redoubt led him to prioritize the southern thrust toward Bavaria, diverting resources away from the northern route that led to Berlin. Meanwhile, the exaggerated estimates of Berlin's defenses convinced him that a direct assault would be a costly and unnecessary diversion from the primary mission of destroying the German army. As we now know, the National Redoubt was largely a fiction, and Berlin's defenses, though formidable in the final days, were nowhere near as strong as SHAEF believed. This intelligence failure would prove to be the foundation for the most consequential strategic decision of the European war. At the heart of Eisenhower's strategic thinking was the concept of the broad front. Having studied the campaigns of Napoleon and the German General Staff, Eisenhower was convinced that the best way to defeat a large and resilient enemy was to advance on a broad front, constantly applying pressure at multiple points to prevent the enemy from concentrating his forces for a decisive counterattack. This approach had worked well in the campaigns of 1944, and Eisenhower saw no reason to abandon it in the final months of the war. The alternative to the broad front was the pencil-like thrust, advocated by Montgomery and Churchill, a concentrated, rapid drive by a single army group toward a strategically vital objective, such as Berlin. Montgomery had used this approach with great success at El Alamein and in the pursuit across North Africa, and he believed that the same tactic could be applied to Germany. The argument for a concentrated thrust was compelling. It would exploit the Wehrmacht's disorganization, strike at the heart of the Nazi regime, and potentially bring the war to a swift conclusion. Eisenhower, however, had several objections to this plan. First, it would require diverting precious fuel and ammunition from other sectors of the front, exposing the Allied flanks to potential German counterattacks. Second, a concentrated thrust was inherently risky. If the German defenses proved stronger than anticipated, the spearhead could be cut off and destroyed. Third, Eisenhower was deeply skeptical of Montgomery's ability to manage such a complex operation. The Field Marshal had a reputation for caution, and his operations often proceeded more slowly than planned. Eisenhower was not convinced that Montgomery's 21st Army Group could execute a rapid drive to Berlin before the Soviets arrived. Beyond these tactical concerns, Eisenhower had a more fundamental strategic conviction. The war would not be won by capturing cities, no matter how symbolic, but by destroying the German capacity to resist. As long as the Wehrmacht retained organized formations, the war would continue. The priority, therefore, had to be the annihilation of German forces in the Ruhr, followed by the elimination of any remaining pockets of resistance in the south. Once the German army was shattered, Berlin would fall like a ripe fruit, and it would not matter which side was the first to enter the city. This was the logic that drove Eisenhower's decisions in the spring of 1945, and it was the logic that would bring him into direct conflict with Churchill. Winston Churchill, by March 1945, was a man at war not only with Germany, but with his own fading influence. At 70 years of age, the British Prime Minister had led his nation through its darkest hour, his defiant speeches rallying a small island against the might of the Nazi Empire. But the physical and mental toll of nearly 6 years of war was evident. He was drinking more heavily, sleeping less, and showing signs of the paranoia and depression that had plagued him throughout his life. Churchill's determination to capture Berlin was not merely a matter of strategy or national prestige. It was a desperate attempt to salvage something of the British Empire's position in the post-war world. He understood, with a clarity that eluded many of his American counterparts, that the global balance of power was shifting inexorably toward the United States and the Soviet Union. Britain, battered by war and economically exhausted, was being reduced to a secondary role. By securing Berlin and the territory around it, Churchill hoped to preserve some influence in continental Europe, ensuring that the British voice would still be heard in the councils of the victorious powers. The Prime Minister's correspondence during this period reveals a man who felt increasingly isolated and ignored. His communications to Roosevelt and Eisenhower were peppered with pleas, warnings, and increasingly sharp rebukes. On March 30th, 1945, he wrote to Roosevelt, "The claim to share in the occupation of Berlin should be staked by the Western Allies as a matter of military necessity. The Soviets have declared that they will take it in their own time. We must not allow the fate of Europe to be decided solely by the armies of the East." Roosevelt's reply was conciliatory but non-committal. The dying president was already focused on the Pacific theater and the looming conflict with Japan. Churchill's frustration was compounded by his strained relationship with Eisenhower. The Supreme Commander, though courteous and professional in his dealings with the British Prime Minister, made it clear that his loyalty was to the combined chiefs of staff in the military mission, not to British political aspirations. Churchill, accustomed to a more direct relationship with military leaders, found this independence infuriating. In private conversation with his military aide, General Hastings Ismay, Churchill remarked, "Eisenhower is a good soldier, but he is no strategist. He sees the war as a set of problems to be solved, not as the foundation for the peace to come." Dwight David Eisenhower, at 54 years of age, was the most powerful American military commander in history. His responsibilities extended across 3 continents, and his decisions affected the lives of millions. Yet, despite his immense authority, Eisenhower was a man of considerable humility. He had risen from humble origins in Kansas to become the supreme commander of the largest military force ever assembled, but he had never lost his sense of duty or his practical Midwestern sensibility. Eisenhower's military philosophy was rooted in his experience as a staff officer in the interwar period. He had studied the wars of the 19th and early 20th centuries, and he was convinced that the key to success in modern warfare was logistics, coordination, and the careful husbanding of resources. He had seen too many ambitious offensives fail because they had overstretched their supply lines or underestimated their costs. He was determined that the final campaign in Europe would not repeat these mistakes. The Supreme Commander was also acutely aware of his political responsibilities. He understood that the Western Alliance was a fragile coalition of nations with divergent interests, and that the slightest misstep could fracture it. His relationship with Churchill, though respectful, was subject to immense strain. His relationship with the Soviet military commanders, particularly Marshal Zhukov, was a delicate dance of cooperation and suspicion. Eisenhower believed that the best way to preserve the alliance was to avoid any action that could be interpreted as a breach of the agreements made at Yalta, even if those agreements were disadvantageous to the West. Perhaps most importantly, Eisenhower was a man who hated war and all its cost. He had seen too many young men die in the fields of Normandy, the forests of the Ardennes, and the mountains of Italy. He was determined that the war should end as quickly as possible, with as few casualties as possible. A bloody street-by-street assault on Berlin, against what his intelligence staff believed to be a heavily fortified city, would cost thousands of American and British lives. Eisenhower was not willing to sacrifice those lives for a political symbol that would, in any case, be handed over to the Soviets at the end of the war. Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery was perhaps the most controversial figure in the Allied High Command. A brilliant tactician and a charismatic leader of men, he was also arrogant, insubordinate, and deeply insecure. His rivalry with Eisenhower had its roots in the Normandy campaign, when Montgomery had repeatedly overpromised and underdelivered, causing considerable friction with his American counterparts. Montgomery's tactical doctrine was fundamentally different from Eisenhower's. He believed in concentration of force, careful preparation, and the exploitation of local superiority to achieve a breakthrough. His victories in North Africa and at the Normandy breakout had demonstrated the effectiveness of this approach, but it also required time and resources that Eisenhower was often unwilling to allocate. Montgomery's relationship with Patton was particularly fraught. The two men represented contrasting styles of generalship. Montgomery's methodical caution versus Patton's aggressive improvisation, and they deeply disliked one another. Despite his personal limitations, Montgomery's strategic assessment of the Berlin situation was not without merit. He argued that the Elbe River, not the Rhine, should be the Western Allies' primary objective, and that a concentrated thrust toward Berlin would exploit the exhaustion of the German forces in the north. Montgomery believed that the Soviets were primarily interested in territorial gain, and that a Western presence in Berlin would deter Stalin from imposing a Soviet-dominated government on all of Germany. Montgomery's frustration with Eisenhower's decision reached a peak in early April, when he sent a strongly worded cable to the Supreme Commander, arguing that the decision to halt at the Elbe was a dereliction of political duty. Eisenhower's response was a pointed reminder that operational decisions were his alone to make. Montgomery, despite his disappointment, was ultimately a pragmatist. He knew that defying Eisenhower would mean the end of his career. General Omar Bradley, Eisenhower's most trusted American lieutenant, played a crucial role in shaping the decision to avoid Berlin. Affectionately nicknamed the GI's general for his concern for the ordinary soldier's welfare, Bradley was a cautious and methodical commander who had led the 12th Army Group with great distinction across France and into Germany. Bradley's influence on Eisenhower cannot be overstated. The two men had known each other since the 1930s, and Bradley had earned Eisenhower's complete trust through his consistent competence and loyalty. When Bradley presented his casualty estimates for a Berlin operation, Eisenhower listened carefully. Bradley argued that a direct assault on the city would cost at least 100,000 Allied casualties, a figure that Eisenhower found unacceptable. In fact, the actual cost of the Soviet assault on Berlin was around 80,000 killed and wounded, far less than Bradley's estimate. But the psychological impact of Bradley's calculations was decisive. Beyond his tactical caution, Bradley shared Eisenhower's skepticism about Montgomery's abilities and his concerns about the National Redoubt. He believed that the American Army, having borne the brunt of the fighting in 1944, should not be forced to accept unnecessary risks for British political objectives. This Anglo-American tension was a persistent undercurrent in the High Command, and Bradley's support gave Eisenhower the confidence to resist Churchill's importuning. If Montgomery was the cautious tactician and Bradley the analytical planner, George S. Patton was the embodiment of aggressive, intuitive military leadership. The commander of the Third Army, Patton had led his troops on a spectacular campaign of pursuit across France, often advancing faster than his supply lines could support. He was the natural choice for a lightning thrust to Berlin, and he deeply resented being directed southward toward the supposed National Redoubt. Patton's diary entries from this period are filled with frustration and contempt. On April 2nd, he wrote, "There is no reason we cannot take Berlin. It is a political objective, but it is also a military one. The Russians will not respect us if we do not take it." His private correspondence with his staff reveals a man who felt that the war was being lost in the High Command, not on the battlefield. He described Eisenhower's orders as a criminal waste of the momentum his army had fought so hard to achieve. Despite his defiance, Patton remained a loyal subordinate. He understood that open disobedience would lead to his relief, and that the only way to influence events was to follow orders while advocating as forcefully as possible for his position. His pivot to the south was executed with characteristic efficiency, but it was a bitter pill to swallow. In the years after the war, Patton would write extensively about the missed opportunity at Berlin, arguing that the decision to halt was one of the great strategic errors of the 20th century. One of the most significant factors influencing Eisenhower's decision was the knowledge, shared only with the highest echelons of the Allied command, that the Manhattan Project was on the verge of producing a functional atomic bomb. While Eisenhower was not privy to the precise details of the project, he was aware that a weapon of immense destructive power was being developed, and that it would be available before the end of 1945. This knowledge fundamentally changed the calculus of the European war. If the United States was developing a weapon that could end the war in the Pacific with a single blow, the urgency of capturing Berlin was diminished. A prolonged campaign in the streets of the German capital would tie up resources that might be needed for the Pacific theater. More importantly, the atomic bomb would dramatically alter the post-war balance of power, making the temporary occupation of Berlin a less pressing concern. The irony of this situation is that the Manhattan Project reinforced Eisenhower's belief that his primary responsibility was the annihilation of the German army, not the occupation of political symbols. As long as the Wehrmacht still had the capacity to resist, the war in Europe would continue. With the atomic bomb looming in the background, the capture of Berlin became even less critical. It was a strategic luxury, not a necessity. The National Redoubt myth was perhaps the most consequential intelligence failure of the European theater. For months, SHAEF intelligence had been receiving reports that the German leadership, led by Hitler himself, was preparing to retreat to the mountainous region of southern Bavaria to wage a guerrilla war that could last for years. These reports were based on intercepted communications, prisoner interrogations, and the testimony of German officers who had been captured or surrendered. The redoubt was said to be stocked with vast quantities of food, ammunition, and equipment. Its defenders, drawn from the most fanatical elements of the SS, would be able to hold out indefinitely, disrupting Allied lines of communication and preventing the establishment of a stable post-war order. The prospect was nightmarish. The war in Europe would continue long after the German government had officially surrendered, with American and British soldiers fighting a guerrilla campaign in a hostile Alpine wilderness. Today, we know that the National Redoubt was largely a fantasy. The Germans did not have the resources or the will to establish such a fortress, and the mountainous terrain of Bavaria was unsuitable for prolonged guerrilla warfare. But in the spring of 1945, the myth was taken seriously by both Eisenhower and Bradley. The decision to redirect Patton's Third Army to the south was driven by the desire to preempt the formation of the redoubt, a decision that seemed prudent at the time, but would have far-reaching consequences. On March 31, 1945, Eisenhower drafted the most consequential cable of his career. It was addressed to the combined chiefs of staff in Washington and London, and its purpose was to establish a clear chain of command for the final phases of the European campaign. In the cable, Eisenhower laid out his operational plan for the destruction of the German armed forces. The Ruhr would be encircled and eliminated. Then the Western Allies would advance to the Elbe River, where they would halt and await the Soviet advance from the east. The decision to halt at the Elbe was the strategic pivot point of the European conflict. By choosing the Elbe as the limit of his advance, Eisenhower effectively ceded Berlin to the Soviets. The decision was based on a combination of military and political considerations, the logistical difficulties of a further advance, the fear of the National Redoubt, the political agreements made at Yalta, and Eisenhower's deep-seated reluctance to pay the price in blood that a direct assault would demand. The reaction to the cable was immediate and ferocious. Churchill, upon reading it, was apoplectic. He fired off a response that expressed his grave concern about the decision, arguing that Berlin was still a strategic objective and that the Western Allies should make every effort to reach it before the Soviets. Eisenhower's reply was firm but courteous. He explained that the decision was based on military necessity and that he would not deviate from his plan. Joseph Stalin was playing a game of his own. The Soviet dictator had long understood that the capture of Berlin was not just a military operation. It was a signal to the world that the Soviet Union was the dominant power in Eastern Europe, and that its voice would be heard in the councils of the victorious powers. Stalin had instructed Zhukov and Konev to take the city as quickly as possible, regardless of the cost. The Soviet offensive that would culminate in the capture of Berlin was one of the largest military operations in history. Over 2.5 million Soviet soldiers, 6,250 tanks, and 7,500 aircraft were assembled for the assault. The operation was preceded by a massive artillery barrage that devastated the German defenses on the Oder River. The Soviet planners had designed an operation that would overwhelm the Germans with sheer mass, overwhelming their ability to resist and securing the city in a matter of days, not weeks. Stalin's decision to launch the offensive in mid-April was timed to coincide with the Western Allies' advance to the Elbe. The Soviet dictator was determined that the Red Army would be the first to enter Berlin, and he was willing to sacrifice tens of thousands of lives to achieve that goal. The rivalry between Zhukov and Konev added an internal dimension to the race, as each marshal sought to outdo the other in the eyes of their leader. Churchill, realizing that his influence over Eisenhower was waning, attempted to use the diplomatic channels to reverse the decision. He appealed directly to Roosevelt, arguing that the political consequences of a Soviet capture of Berlin would be disastrous for the West. In a series of urgent telegrams, he outlined his fears that Stalin would use the occupation of the German capital as a platform to impose communist governments on the rest of Europe. Roosevelt, however, was too ill and too focused on the Pacific War to intervene. His reply to Churchill was vague and noncommittal, urging patience and cooperation with the military commanders. The president, whose health was rapidly declining, had already made his peace with the Yalta agreements and was not inclined to reopen the debate. To Churchill's frustration, Roosevelt seemed unable or unwilling to understand the gravity of the situation. The British Prime Minister then turned to the British military command, urging them to exert what pressure they could on Eisenhower and the Americans. The chief of the Imperial General Staff, Sir Alan Brooke, was sympathetic to Churchill's concerns, but he recognized that the balance of power in the alliance had shifted decisively toward the United States. Britain, exhausted and increasingly dependent on American support, had little choice but to accept Eisenhower's decisions. On April 16, 1945, the Soviet offensive began. The opening artillery barrage was so intense that it could be heard by the Western troops on the Elbe, more than 100 kilometers away. The Soviet forces crashed into the German defenses on the Silo Heights, overwhelming them with a combination of weight of numbers and sheer brutality. The fighting was savage, with the German defenders, many of them elderly men and children, fighting with the desperation of the condemned. By April 25th, the Soviet forces had encircled the city, and Zhukov and Konev were engaged in a race to capture the Reichstag, the symbolic center of German power. The fighting in the city was characterized by street-by-street, building-by-building combat, with both sides suffering heavy casualties. The German defenders, despite their poor training and equipment, fought fiercely, motivated by fear of Soviet reprisals and the knowledge that the war was lost. On April 30th, Hitler committed suicide in his bunker beneath the Reich Chancellery. His death marked the end of the Third Reich, though the Soviet assault continued until the city was completely secured. The final surrender of the German garrison on May 2nd, 1945, signaled the end of the war in Europe. The Red Army had achieved its objective, but at a terrible cost. Over 80,000 Soviet soldiers had been killed in the final assault, along with an unknown number of German civilians. While the Soviet forces were engaged in their apocalyptic assault on Berlin, the Western Allies stood silent on the Elbe. The American and British troops, who had advanced so quickly and so successfully across France and Germany, were under strict orders to halt. They watched helplessly as the Red Army completed its conquest of the German capital. The silence was not merely a physical absence. It was a strategic void. The decision to halt at the Elbe created a psychological divide between the Western Allies and the Soviet Union that would persist for decades. The Western troops felt a palpable sense of betrayal, a feeling that they had been denied a share of the victory that was rightfully theirs. This resentment would fester and grow, contributing to the breakdown of trust that characterized the early Cold War. For Eisenhower, the silence was a source of quiet satisfaction. He had achieved his strategic objectives without paying the price in blood that a direct assault on Berlin would have demanded. The war in Europe was over, and he could now turn his attention to the challenges of the Pacific and the reconstruction of a shattered continent. The political implications of the halt would become clear only in the years that followed. In July 1945, Churchill, now joined by President Harry Truman, met with Stalin in the suburb of Potsdam, near Berlin, to finalize the post-war settlement. The atmosphere at the conference was markedly different from Yalta. The war in Europe was over, and the United States had tested the first atomic bomb, giving Truman an unprecedented diplomatic advantage. Churchill, whose Conservative Party had just suffered a crushing electoral defeat, was replaced midway through the conference by Clement Attlee, the new Labour Prime Minister. The results of the Potsdam Conference reaffirmed the divisions that had been established at Yalta. Germany was to be divided into 4 occupation zones, with Berlin similarly partitioned. The Western Allies would retain control of their sectors, but they were surrounded by Soviet-held territory, creating a vulnerable enclave deep within the Eastern Bloc. The agreements made at Potsdam would provide the foundation for the Cold War division of Europe. Churchill, who had watched the proceedings with growing despair, delivered one of his most famous speeches in March 1946, in which he coined the term Iron Curtain to describe the division that had fallen across the continent. He had been proven right about Stalin's ambitions, but his warnings had come too late. The Iron Curtain was already descending, and the opportunity to prevent it had been lost. The decision to halt at the Elbe set the stage for the most dangerous confrontations of the Cold War. The divided city of Berlin, located deep in the heart of Soviet-controlled East Germany, became a symbol of the East-West divide and a constant source of tension. The first crisis erupted in June 1948, when the Soviet Union imposed a blockade on all land and water routes to the western sectors of the city, hoping to force the Allies to abandon their enclave. The Western response was the Berlin Airlift, one of the largest and most successful humanitarian operations in history. Over the course of a year, American and British aircraft transported thousands of tons of food, fuel, and supplies to the beleaguered city. The Soviet Union, realizing that the blockade had failed, lifted it in May 1949. But the crisis marked the beginning of a long period of confrontation. The construction of the Berlin Wall in 1961 was another grim consequence of the divisions established in 1945. The wall, which physically divided the city for nearly 3 decades, became the most potent symbol of the Cold War and the division of Europe. The decision to halt at the Elbe had effectively made Berlin a front line in a new type of conflict, a battle not of armies, but of ideologies. The historical debate over the decision to halt at the Elbe has continued for generations. On one side are those who argue that Eisenhower's caution was the hallmark of a wise commander who refused to sacrifice his soldiers for a political objective. They point to the high cost of the Soviet assault on Berlin, the logistical difficulties that the Western Allies would have faced, and the political agreements that had already been made at Yalta and Potsdam. On the other side are those who argue that Eisenhower's decision was a catastrophic mistake that allowed the Soviet Union to dominate Eastern Europe for a generation. They point to the political implications of the Soviet capture of Berlin, the psychological impact on the post-war settlement, and the opportunities that were lost. Churchill's warnings, they argue, were prophetic. The Western Allies won the military war, but lost the political peace. The truth, as is often the case, lies somewhere in between. Eisenhower's decision was based on a realistic assessment of the military situation and a genuine concern for the welfare of his soldiers. The political agreements had already been made, and any attempt to occupy Berlin would have required the United States and Britain to abandon those agreements. The long-term consequences of the decision were profound, but they were not the result of a single tactical choice. The question that haunts the history of the European theater is what would have happened if Eisenhower had followed Churchill's advice and ordered a drive to Berlin. Would the Western Allies have been able to reach the city before the Soviets? And if they had, would they have been able to prevent the Iron Curtain from falling across Europe? The answers to these questions are uncertain, but they can be approximated. It is likely that the Western Allies could have reached Berlin before the Soviets, if they had diverted sufficient resources to the northern thrust. Montgomery's 21st Army Group was well positioned for the drive, and the Germans in the north were in a state of collapse. A determined, concentrated effort would have brought the Allies to the city's outskirts in a matter of days. But even if the Western Allies had reached Berlin first, it is highly unlikely that they could have prevented the division of Europe. The political agreements made at Yalta had already established the spheres of influence, and Stalin was determined to ensure that Eastern Europe would fall under Soviet control. The occupation of Berlin by the Western Allies would have been a temporary arrangement. They would eventually have had to withdraw to their designated zones, leaving the Soviets in control of the surrounding territory. The Iron Curtain was not primarily a military reality. It was a political and ideological one. As long as Stalin was determined to extend Soviet influence into Eastern Europe, the division of the continent was inevitable. The capture of Berlin by the Western Allies might have changed the optics of the Cold War, but it would not have altered its fundamental dynamics. Dwight Eisenhower, after the war, would reflect on the decision with a mixture of satisfaction and regret. He had achieved his primary objective, the destruction of the German army and the end of the war in Europe. He had preserved the fragile Western alliance and maintained the trust of the combined chiefs of staff. But he had also witnessed the descent of the Iron Curtain across Europe, and he must have wondered whether a different decision might have changed the course of history. When Eisenhower became president of the United States in 1953, he was confronted with the consequences of his own decisions. The Cold War had become the defining reality of international relations, and the United States was engaged in a global struggle with the Soviet Union. Eisenhower's approach to the Cold War was characterized by the same caution and pragmatism that had defined his military strategy. He avoided unnecessary risks, built alliances, and sought to contain Soviet expansion without directly confronting it. Eisenhower's legacy as a soldier and a statesman remains contested. His admirers see him as a man of principle and integrity, a leader who put the welfare of his soldiers and his nation above his own ambitions. His critics, particularly those aligned with the Churchillian perspective, see him as a figure who was too cautious, too willing to accept political limitations, and too focused on the short term to appreciate the long-term consequences of his actions. Winston Churchill's reputation as a prophet of the Cold War has only grown over time. His warnings about Stalin's ambitions, his insistence on the political significance of Berlin, and his advocacy for a stronger Western presence in Europe have all been vindicated by history. Churchill, unlike many of his contemporaries, understood that the war was not just about defeating Germany, it was about shaping the post-war world. Churchill's political career after the war was marked by a series of frustrations. He was defeated in the 1945 elections, only to return to power in 1951. But his influence over British foreign policy was limited. The British Empire, which he had spent his entire life defending, was in terminal decline, and the United States, not Britain, was now the dominant power in the West. Churchill's vision of a unified Europe, led by Britain and France, was never realized. Yet Churchill's legacy endures. His speeches, his writings, and his political actions continue to inspire those who believe in the values of democracy, freedom, and the rule of law. His warnings about the dangers of totalitarianism and the importance of collective security remain as relevant today as they were in 1945. Field Marshal Montgomery, in the years after the war, dedicated himself to the rehabilitation of his reputation. His memoirs, published in 1958, were a scathing indictment of the American-dominated Allied command structure. Montgomery argued that the failure to capture Berlin was the culmination of a series of mistakes, driven by Eisenhower's lack of strategic vision and the Americans' obsession with operational perfection. Montgomery's critiques were not without merit. His tactical analysis of the Berlin campaign was compelling, and his belief in the importance of concentrated, decisive action had been vindicated by the success of the D-Day landings and the Normandy breakout. His argument that the Western Allies should have taken a more aggressive approach to the final phases of the war was shared by many of his contemporaries, including Patton. However, Montgomery's memoirs were also marked by the same arrogance and self-promotion that had characterized his wartime behavior. His criticisms of Eisenhower were often petty and personal, and he was unwilling to acknowledge his own failings. The result was a book that reinforced the divisions of the war and added to the historical debate without resolving it. One of the most powerful arguments in favor of Eisenhower's decision was the moral one, the preservation of lives. Eisenhower, unlike Churchill, was directly responsible for the deployment of hundreds of thousands of troops. He knew that every decision he made would lead to the death of some soldiers and the survival of others. The choice to sacrifice soldiers for a political symbol was a moral one, and Eisenhower made it with a clear conscience. The counter-argument, articulated by Churchill and his supporters, is that the long-term consequences of the decision were themselves a moral issue. By allowing the Soviet Union to occupy Berlin, the Western Allies effectively abandoned Eastern Europe to decades of communist domination. The suffering inflicted by Stalinism on the peoples of Eastern Europe, the suppression of dissent, the destruction of civil society, the erosion of human rights, was a moral catastrophe of immense proportions. The decision to avoid Berlin, Churchill argued, was not just a military error, it was a moral failure. There is no simple resolution to this moral debate. The preservation of lives in the short term is a compelling moral imperative, but the prevention of long-term suffering is equally important. Eisenhower made his choice based on his values and his responsibilities, and it is impossible to say with certainty that a different choice would have led to a better outcome. The war in the Pacific was a constant presence in the minds of the American leadership in the spring of 1945. The United States was engaged in an increasingly brutal campaign against Japan, and the prospect of a massive invasion of the Japanese home islands was looming. Every soldier killed in Europe was a soldier who could not be used in the Pacific. Every resource devoted to the European campaign was a resource that could not be redirected to the fight against Japan. This reality was a significant factor in Eisenhower's decision-making. He knew that the war in the Pacific was likely to continue for months, if not years, and that the United States would need every available soldier for the final assault on Japan. The decision to conserve resources and avoid unnecessary casualties in Europe was therefore driven by a strategic calculus that extended beyond the immediate theater. The development of the atomic bomb would eventually render the invasion of Japan unnecessary, but Eisenhower and his colleagues could not have known that in April 1945. The Manhattan Project was a closely guarded secret, and even those who knew about its existence were uncertain of its success. Eisenhower's decision to halt at the Elbe was, in part, a decision to conserve resources for what was expected to be the most difficult and costly campaign of the war. The logistics of the Western Allies' advance in the spring of 1945 were a constant source of concern. The rapid pace of the advance had stretched supply lines to the breaking point, and there was a constant shortage of fuel, ammunition, and other critical supplies. The problem was compounded by the destruction of the German rail network and the difficulty of supplying forces through the devastated terrain of Western Germany. Eisenhower was acutely aware of these logistical constraints. He knew that a concentrated drive to Berlin would require an immense concentration of resources, and that there was no guarantee that the necessary supplies could be delivered. The German defenders, though weakened, still had the capacity to disrupt supply lines through guerrilla attacks and sabotage. A single determined counterattack could cut off the Allied spearhead and leave it surrounded and isolated. Montgomery, while acknowledging the logistical challenges, argued that they could be overcome with careful planning and decisive action. He pointed to the success of the Normandy landings and the breakout from the beachhead as evidence that concentrated force could overcome even the most daunting logistical obstacles. Eisenhower, however, remained unconvinced. He had seen too many ambitious operations fail because of supply problems, and he was not willing to take that risk in the final weeks of the war. The decision to halt at the Elbe had significant political consequences that extended far beyond the immediate theater. The agreements made at Yalta were based on the assumption that the Western Allies would control certain territories, but the actual military situation was fluid. By halting at the Elbe, Eisenhower effectively confirmed the Yalta division of Germany and ensured that the Soviet Union would dominate Eastern Europe. The political fallout of this decision was felt immediately. The Soviet Union, now in control of Berlin and much of Eastern Germany, was in a position to impose its will on the rest of Europe. The United States and Britain, having failed to secure the capital, were forced to accept a secondary role in the post-war order. The division of Europe, which had been a potential outcome of the Yalta negotiations, became a reality. The Potsdam Conference, held in July and August 1945, was the final act of the wartime alliance. The leaders of the three powers, Truman, Churchill, and then Attlee, and Stalin, met to finalize the post-war settlement. The agreements made at Potsdam reflected the realities on the ground. The division of Germany and Berlin into 4 zones, the borders of Poland, and the future of Eastern Europe. The conference ended with the Western Allies in a weaker position than they had anticipated, and the Soviet Union in a stronger one. The story of the decision to halt at the Elbe, it is a cautionary tale about the relationship between military action and political objectives. The decision-makers of 1945 were faced with a choice between 2 competing priorities: the immediate objective of ending the war and the long-term objective of shaping the post-war world. Their choice to prioritize the immediate objective had far-reaching consequences that would shape the world for decades. The lesson for contemporary statesmen and military leaders is clear. Military strategy cannot be divorced from political strategy. The objectives of a war must be clearly defined, and the military operations designed to achieve those objectives must be aligned with the broader political goals. When military and political objectives diverge, the result is often a strategic failure that undermines the purpose of the war itself. The Berlin decision also highlights the importance of coalition warfare. The Allied coalition of 1945 was a delicate balance of competing national interests, and the success of the coalition depended on the willingness of its members to cooperate and compromise. When one member of the coalition pursues its own objectives at the expense of others, the coalition is weakened and the long-term goals of the alliance are compromised. We return at last to the question that has haunted this narrative. If the Western Allies had ignored the logistical risks and followed Churchill's urgent mandate to reach Berlin first, would they have prevented the Iron Curtain from ever falling across Europe? The most honest answer is that we cannot know. The capture of Berlin by the Western Allies might have changed the dynamics of the post-war settlement, making Stalin more cautious and less willing to impose his will on Eastern Europe. It might have given the West more leverage in the negotiations at Potsdam and allowed them to extract concessions from the Soviet Union. It might have prevented the division of Germany and the construction of the Berlin Wall. However, it is equally possible that the Western occupation of Berlin would have made no difference. Stalin was determined to maintain control over Eastern Europe, and he had the military power to do so. The United States and Britain were not willing to go to war with the Soviet Union to prevent the imposition of communist governments, and the agreements made at Yalta had already established the framework for a divided Europe. The Iron Curtain in this view was an inevitability, a consequence of the Soviet Union's emergence as a global superpower and the West's unwillingness to confront it. What is certain is that the decision to halt at the Elbe was a moment of profound historical significance. It was a choice between two competing visions of the future, and the choice that was made shaped the world we live in today. The story of the Berlin decision reminds us that the course of history is not determined by inevitable forces, but by the choices of individuals, and that those choices have consequences that resonate for generations. If you were in Eisenhower's position in April 1945, knowing the cost of human life, but also the long-term political implications of a Soviet-controlled Berlin, would you have ordered the push for the capital? Why or why not? Explain your tactical reasoning in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell.